What was your wow, this really is a small world moment? An eccentric coworker of mine from 10 years ago once told me a story about his 6 marriages. His 4th marriage, or maybe his 3rd, who knows, did not last very long and ended as an amicable divorce. He met a woman, they fell in love, got engaged, planned a wedding. At the wedding, many of the guests recognized each other. Turns out the bride and groom were cousins and didn't know it. How it got that far is sort of beyond me. I actually just had one. My coworker and I were talking about a play I had gone to 2 years ago. She mentioned that she had her wedding reception at the same building. I remembered seeing a wedding happening the day I went. I went home to find my ticket. It was the last play I saw with my grandma before she died, and it was the exact same day of their wedding reception. We had actually sneaked up there to get a look at her dress. We're now BFFs. Lol, who would have guessed it? I rode on a bus in rural South Korea where I met a Korean who attended college in the isolated small town of 8,000 people in where I'm from. I went to high school in Bowling Green, Ohio. In college I was in Florence, Italy for a 6-week study abroad class. My friends and I were in a large farmer's market and went to an empty back hallway with no open shops to figure out our next steps. 3 people around our age start walking toward us from the other end of the hallway. As they get close, one looks familiar to me. We lock eyes. We recognize each other. Mark? I say in utter shock. His eyes are wide. All our friends are confused as we embrace and laugh like weirdos. My friend from freaking Bowling Green High School was in the same abandoned hallway as me in the middle of Florence freaking Italy. We did not go to the same college. We had not spoken since high school. There was no planning. Just pure coincidence in the smallest world. My belt died in a French small town at the start of a cycle holiday. Went to a clothing shop to buy a new one. Had to ask the black security guard where the belts were. Think I tried speaking French to him. As I looked at the belts, I talked to my aunt in Norwegian. The security guard came over and asked in Norwegian if we were Norwegian. Was baffled and confused. Suspected some scam. Talked some to him. Based on where he had lived in Norway, I think he had been an asylum seeker that had been returned to France, as per the Dublin regulation. Unlike extremely multicultural Paris, this was La France profonde where you hardly saw any black or Muslim people. And the only black person I saw in this small country town addressed me in my own Norwegian tongue. My wife and I lived in the same county, 260,000 population roughly, but did not go to any schools together or anything like that. We connected in our late 20s through a mutual friend. When I proposed, my mom and her mom ended up meeting obviously. My mom recognized her mom and told me she was pretty sure my fiancé and I had been preschool classmates. Lo and behold, my mom digs through a bunch of pictures and finds the preschool class photo, locates me in the photograph and guess who is directly next to me in the photo? My now wife. We printed out an enlarged copy of the photo and displayed it in our wedding reception. Lived in NYC and was walking to happy hour and saw on a random street my old coworker from when I worked/lived in LA. He was on a work trip and hailing a taxi to head back to the airport. Didn't see him again after that. 2 years later, walking on a small side street in LA to grab food for my lunch break, had moved back to LA, and saw the same guy also walking on the street as he apparently worked at an office nearby. We both stopped dead in the sidewalk and had to get off our respective phone calls to relish the WTF small world moment. When I separated from significant other and went on a date, we stopped at guy's apartment and his roommate was so best friend's cousin who was the guy my so bought weed from. I walked in and seen him and all I could say was, "What's up? Name redacted." Both of us had the most confused look, but he still hasn't bussed me out that I know of. I'm an American who lives in Norway. A few years ago, I was returning from a trip to visit family when the immigration agent at Oslo airport looked at my passport and said, "Pennsylvania. Is that where you've been?" I said yes, and he mentioned he had been an exchange student in Pennsylvania. At the same time I was in high school, at the high school in a neighboring school district. We stayed in a hostel in a small town in Hokkaido, Japan and met this guy from Guadalajara, Mexico. About a year and a half later we were walking in Mexico City in the city center and take a wrong turn down a street and my girlfriend goes, "That looks like the guy we met in Japan." Sure enough, I yell out his name and we were both just in shock to see each other. A million years ago in high school, I went on a group camping trip in upstate Minnesota. We were all strangers to start but became friends. Months later I went to visit UT Austin because college visits and ran into one of the girls from the trip in a bar where she was performing at SXSW. Neither of us were from anywhere near Minnesota or Texas. Had a best friend in 2nd grade. Then I moved away out of state and didn't talk to him anymore. In college my roommate had a coworker over, and after we introduced ourselves the coworker recognized my name and I found out he was my 2nd grade best friend. Ends up we didn't even go to the same college, he was in the area for a co-op. Now we're good friends again after 15 plus years. From Florida, I was going to grad school in Rochester, New York. I was getting some coffee at the coffee shop, and out of the corner of my eye, saw a flyer for a band I used to play in. I hadn't talked to any of them in years. I went to the show, and ended up hanging backstage with them. Fun times! Through the Facebook I've learned that both my high school sweetheart and the guy I lost my virginity to, not the same person, both now live in the same city as I do. It's 2,500 miles from where we grew up. I haven't run into them yet, and I cross my fingers that I won't. My wife was born in the state of California. In a hospital that technically no longer exists, it burned down and got rebuilt. She was born with a heart murmur. About 24 years later, she's at college getting her master's degree in Vermont. While doing her master's degree, a nurse from California spoke to her class, telling them about a familiar case of heart murmur in a newborn infant. How one of the hardest pieces of the job is you never know what happened after patients with problems like that leave the hospital. It was my wife's case she was talking about. She ended up getting to speak to the nurse after her presentation, the nurse who was instrumental in her birth. My friends and I used to play a lot of Red Orchestra too. Whenever we'd play, there would be a good chance a player by the name of Baki would join the German team. Baki was great because he would always yell in the most perfect German, he'd call out enemy positions in German, he'd alert us to incoming artillery in German, and if you asked nicely he would even just talk about any topic you give him in German. I kid you not, it sounded like it came straight from some World War II Nazi propaganda video. Over the course of who knows how many games, we had only heard him speak a single sentence in English. At some point I had sent him a friend request on Steam so we could try to hop on the game at the same time as him. Months later we had stopped playing Red Orchestra too much and I was kind of curious what Baki was up to, so I checked my friends list to see if he had been online recently. Baki was nowhere to be found, but someone had changed their name to store name town name of the small grocery store I stop at in bumfuck nowhere to grab donuts on my way to work. I checked the name history and sure enough it was Baki. I messaged him about it and we had a good laugh, but I never did get to meet him in person. I just always found it amusing that a random guy on the internet yelling in German happened to work in the same part of bumfuck nowhere Wisconsin that I did. On a trip to Europe we met the same people who live in our housing complex 3 times in 3 different cities of 3 different countries. Well, guess that's just the touring agencies trying to one-up each other lol. I was sitting behind my friend's house in Germany when these Mormon missionaries knocked at the door. One of them was from the same no-name town in Oklahoma, where I lived as a kid. We once went on a trip to New York City. On our way to my hometown's airport, we passed by this business that makes pizza ovens. Flash forward past our 8-hour flight and we decide to have some pizza on our way to the hotel. We end up getting a table right in front of the kitchen so we can see everything going on there. Lo and behold, the oven directly in front of us is from the very same company in my hometown. We could tell because it was branded with Ops Hometown Oven Company. I had my ex from the UK send me a selfie with a doc I knew from India. Both were at the same charity veterinary event in Egypt, got to talking, and both realized they knew me. Family vacation in Playa del Carmen, Mexico. We get on a bus that picks up guests from several resorts in the area to go on a tour of Chichen Itza. Meet a guy and his family and start talking. Turns out he was a good friend of my uncle's, they were part of the same antique Corvette society. My mom and dad got out of the subway near Times Square the first time they visited New York and met my aunt and uncle. Wasn't planned. I have several of these stories. Mostly from my time in the army, as the military is a smaller world. 1. Went to linguistics school, and one day while walking to the mail room, ran into a schoolmate and his girlfriend. I was in the army, he was Navy and they had graduated a year ahead of me, 1,000 miles from home. 2. Had 2 classmates that joined the army, 1 and 2 weeks ahead of me, different jobs and schools. 2 years later, I found out that both were in Germany also. Yes, I did find out where through the postal service, and we ended up having dinner together. 3. While on vacation in Europe, I met 3 lovely young ladies on the ship from Greece to Italy. After we landed, we said our goodbyes. 1 week later, ran into them again on the street in Nice, after taking completely different paths to get there. 4. In high school, we had an exchange student from Finland, who was on the swim team with me. 5 years later, we ran into each other in a club in Seattle. He had gone back home after his year, but had just came back to Seattle a few weeks before. I was in the military 50 miles away and had never been to that club before, nor again. 5. While deployed to Panama, active duty, I ran into an officer, who I had gone to basic training with me, in the same platoon, 5 years before. He was enlisted, went into the reserves, became an officer, and also deployed to Panama with his unit. Different paths, we both became military policemen. There are a couple more stories, but this gives you an idea how often it can happen. Met my first ever crush for a second time 8 years after meeting her the first time, and surprisingly I'm still crushing on her. I decided to travel to New Zealand, am from Sweden so it's pretty far, and ended up staying at a hostel in Auckland for a while. One day when I'm walking down to the reception, one of my old classmates from high school walks in. None of us knew that the other one was an NZ.